Sugar was not food, not in this world, not in this century. It was currency. It was medicine. It was the language that courts spoke when words were too dangerous. One man knew how to translate it. He worked before dawn, in the kitchens below the palace, shaping what the king needed to say. This is Hands of History. If you are new here, welcome. If this is where you come to rest, welcome back. Tonight, the confectioner. Sugar did not arrive at the table the way bread arrived, or meat, or ale. It arrived differently, carried, presented, set down with care, in the way that something valuable is set down when the people in the room are meant to notice. In the 15th century, sugar cost more than most men earned in a week. A pound of it, refined, white, the kind that the court required, came from cane grown in Cyprus or Madeira, processed by hands that would never see England, carried across water and through merchant hands, in Venice and Genoa and Antwerp, before it reached a London warehouse, and eventually a royal kitchen. By the time it arrived, it had traveled further than most of the men who would eat it. This is worth holding for a moment, not the taste of it, not the sweetness, but the distance, the weight of what it had crossed to get there. At the table of a Tudor king, sugar was not a flavoring, it was a declaration. The man who could afford to use it freely, to build with it, to shape it into forms that would be carried into a hall on a platter and set before his guests. That man was telling you something about himself that did not need to be said aloud. He had connections that reached to the Mediterranean. He had money that most people could not count. He had access to a world that existed, for most of England, only as rumor. Everyone in the room understood this. That was the point. But sugar was not only wealth. In the world the Tudor court inhabited, the line between food and medicine was not the line we draw now. Physicians trained in the humoral tradition found sugar useful. It was warming. It was preserving. It could be combined with spices and herbs into preparations that were both something you ate and something that was doing work on the body while you ate it. The confectioner stood at the edge of this, not a physician, not a cook in the ordinary sense, something between the two, trained in the properties of substances that most people never handled. The skills required were not simple. They took years to learn. And above the medicine, above the wealth, above the rarity, there was something else that sugar could do, something that required a particular kind of court, a particular kind of politics, a particular appetite for meaning made visible. Sugar could carry a message. Not as metaphor, as fact. You could take this white, expensive, malleable substance and work it with your hands and make it into a shape that meant something. A castle, a ship, a saint, a king on a throne, and carry that shape into a hall and set it on the table, and the people in the room would read it. They would understand what it was saying, and then they would eat it. The object that had spoken was gone, the message remained, and the man who had made it had gone back to the kitchen. This is where the story begins, not in the hall. in the room behind it. Hampton Court, in the years of Henry VIII, was not one building. It was a city. More than 1,000 people lived and worked within its walls when the court was in residence. They ate twice a day at the king's expense, and feeding them required a machine, a kitchen complex that occupied nearly a quarter of the palace's footprint, organized into departments, each with its own function, its own staff, its own place in the hierarchy of the household. There was the great kitchen, where the roasting and boiling happened, the fire and the noise and the constant movement of large quantities of meat. There was the pastry, where the bread was made. There was the boiling house, the saucery, the scalding house, and there was the confectionery. It was a separate room, set apart from the noise of the main kitchen, which mattered, because the work done there required a different kind of attention. The confectionery handled sugar. It handled marzipan and candied fruits, spiced wines and wafers, the preparations that would appear at the end of a formal meal or at the intimate sweet banquet that followed it. The ingredients were expensive. The margin for error was small. The room had its own hierarchy. A master confectioner oversaw the work, with assistants beneath him, men who were learning the craft, who handled the simpler preparations, while the master reserved judgment on the harder ones. The position of master was not filled quickly or easily. A confectioner, who could work sugar at the level the court required, had taken years to become that person, and the household knew it. The wage reflected this. So did the latitude given in how the work was organized. The tools were specialized, copper pans of different sizes for different preparations, each one used for specific temperatures, specific quantities, molds made of wood or metal, carved into the shapes that sugar would be pressed into, flowers, leaves, heraldic devices, human figures in miniature, wooden boards for rolling and shaping, wire for structural support inside larger pieces, fine brushes for applying color, gold leaf, saffron, crushed minerals that produced the reds and blues and greens that made a finished subtlety look from across a great hall like something alive. Heat was everything in this work, and heat was the problem. Sugar behaves differently at different temperatures. It melts, it sets, it crystallizes, it burns, and the difference between a successful preparation and a ruined one could be a matter of minutes or less. A confectioner who could not read the state of a boiling sugar by sight and smell had not yet learned the work. The ability to judge it, to know without any instrument what the sugar was doing and what it needed next, was the center of the craft. This knowledge was not written down in any form that a beginner could simply read and apply. It was demonstrated. The master showed the assistant what to look for, the color shift, the way the surface moved, the sound of the boil changing as the water cooked off and the sugar concentrated. The assistant watched and tried and failed and watched again. This knowledge was not written down in any form that a beginner could simply read and apply. It was demonstrated. The master showed the assistant what to look for, the color shift, the way the surface moved, the sound of the boil changing as the water cooked off and the sugar concentrated. The assistant watched, and tried, and failed, and watched again. The elaborate centerpieces, the sugar sculptures that would be carried into a great hall in front of hundreds of guests, were not made the morning of the feast. They were built over days, sometimes longer, layer by layer, each element made separately and assembled, checked, corrected. This was skilled labor. It was also invisible labor, because when the piece arrived at the table, no one in the hall was thinking about the room where it had been made, the hours it had taken, the hands that had shaped it. They were thinking about what it meant, what the king was saying, what the occasion required. The maker was not part of that conversation. He had never been intended to be. The word used for these sugar sculptures was subtlety. It is a precise word, chosen carefully. In the 16th century, a subtlety could mean a demonstration of skill or ingenuity, something crafted with wit, with intelligence, with a kind of knowledge that was not on the surface, but underneath. The word described the object and the method at the same time. To make a subtlety was to make something that worked on two levels, what you could see and what it meant. The earliest records of sugar subtleties in England reach back to the early 15th century. At the coronation feast of the young Henry VI in 1429, subtleties were carried between courses, elaborate sugar sculptures depicting saints, biblical scenes, figures of royalty. Each one announced something: the legitimacy of the new king, the blessing of the church, the continuity of the crown. The guests ate the announcement, and the evening moved forward. By the time of the Tudors, the practice had developed. The occasions had changed, the messages had become sharper, and the confectioners who made these objects were working at the intersection of art, politics, and craft, whether they thought of it in those terms or not. Consider what the commission actually required. A great lord received a visit from the Queen. He needed to make a gift, something that expressed loyalty without civility, admiration without presumption, the right kind of deference at the right level of spectacle. He called for the confectioner. The confectioner received the brief, a description of what was needed, what it should depict, what it should convey, and went back to his room to translate it into sugar. The translation was technical and interpretive at the same time. What form would carry the message? What scale? What level of detail? These were not questions with obvious answers. They required judgment, and the confectioner's judgment was what the commission was buying, even when the commission was described only in terms of the final object. In 1589, shortly after the defeat of the Spanish Armada, Elizabeth I was presented with a sugar sculpture depicting England's patron saint. The occasion was the New Year gift-giving ceremony, a formal ritual of the court. The object was immediately legible: St. George, England, the Protestant victory over Catholic Spain, the Queen herself as the embodiment of English power. Everyone in the room understood it without explanation. The confectioner who made it understood it too. He had shaped every element to carry the meaning that the occasion required. And then he had stepped back, and the object had entered the ceremony, and his part in it was over. Not only compliments were conveyed this way, rebukes were too, sly ones, careful ones, messages aimed at specific people in the room that could be denied if challenged. The subtlety gave its maker cover. The object spoke. The maker had only made an object. Working for the crown meant working to a standard that did not forgive mistakes. The ingredients were recorded on arrival, weighed, assessed, allocated. The accounts were kept with the same attention that applied to every other department of the household, not because the clerks distrusted the confectioner, but because the household ran on documentation, and documentation required that every transaction be recorded, justified, traceable. Working for the crown meant working to a standard that did not forgive mistakes. The ingredients were recorded on arrival, weighed, assessed, allocated. The accounts were kept with the same attention that applied to every other department of the household, not because the clerks distrusted the confectioner, but because the household ran on documentation, and documentation required that every transaction be recorded, justified, traceable. The pressure of the commission was different from the pressure of ordinary cooking. A roast that was overdone could be covered, adjusted, served anyway. A sugar sculpture that cracked or collapsed the night before a state banquet could not. There was no substitute. There was no time to begin again. The object had to arrive at the table whole, intact, in the form the occasion required. This meant that the confectioner carried the risk of the feast in a way that other kitchen staff did not. The cooks worked in volume. He worked in singularity. There was one centerpiece, and it was his. The timeline added its own pressure. A commission might arrive 3 weeks before the occasion, or 2, or 1. The brief might be detailed or vague, a subject named, a size suggested, the rest left to judgment. The confectioner had to assess what was possible in the time available, what materials he had or could obtain, what level of complexity the occasion warranted without overreaching the brief or falling short of it. Getting this wrong was its own kind of failure, distinct from technical failure, but no less visible. The confectioner had to assess what was possible in the time available, what materials he had or could obtain, what level of complexity the occasion warranted without overreaching the brief or falling short of it. Getting this wrong was its own kind of failure, distinct from technical failure, but no less visible. Others were left to his judgment. He was reading the court while he worked, listening to what was discussed, noting who was in favor and who was not, understanding the shifts in the political weather that determined what a given occasion required. A subtlety made for a feast honoring a man who had since fallen from grace was a problem that had to be anticipated before it became one. The confectioner who understood the court well enough to see these things coming was more valuable than the one who only understood sugar. An object that missed the intention was not simply an aesthetic failure. It was a failure of communication, and in a court where communication was everything, where the smallest gesture carried meaning, where the wrong symbol in the wrong room could end a career, a confectioner who consistently misjudged the brief did not remain a confectioner for long. The work required, in other words, a kind of intelligence that went well beyond technical skill. It required an understanding of the court, of its hierarchies, its moods, its unspoken requirements, that only came from being inside it, paying attention for years. Most of them left no record. The household accounts show purchases, sugar, almonds, rosewater, spices, and they show deliveries, preparations made, occasions served. The people who did the work appear, when they appear at all, as line items, a wage paid, a name in a list. Nothing more. One name survives with something more attached to it. Lucy Cornwallis was the confectioner to Henry VIII during the years of Anne Boleyn. She worked in the kitchens at Hampton Court and at the palaces that the court moved between, making the preparations that the king's table required, the sweet banquet courses, the spiced confections, and when occasions demanded them, the subtleties. What makes her unusual is not the work, it is what the work earned her. Henry gave her a house in Aldgate. Not a wage increase, not a formal appointment to a higher position, a house in the city, in her name. This was recognition of a kind that the crown did not extend to household staff as a matter of course. It meant something. It meant that the king valued what she did, specifically, not just as a function to be filled. She was a woman in a kitchen that was otherwise staffed by men. The records do not say how she came to be there, or how long the arrangement had existed before the house in Aldgate was given. The household did not typically explain itself. People held positions, received wages, were noted when they left, and the circumstances of their arrival were rarely recorded. What the records do show is that she was there during the most turbulent years of the Tudor court. Anne Boleyn rose and fell. The break with Rome reshaped England's politics and its religion. Men who had been close to the king found themselves on the wrong side of an accusation and did not recover. Lucy Cornwallis remained. She continued to work. She received her house. The court moved on. She made things that were eaten. She made things that said something, and then were eaten. The king's table required it, and she provided it, and what she thought of the occasion she served, what she made of the figures who came and went above her, in the halls where her work was consumed. The record does not say. It never does. The evening followed its structure. The hall had filled in the way that great halls filled, not all at once, but gradually, the higher ranks taking their seats first, the arrangement of the room itself communicating who was present and what their position required of them. The candles were lit. The first courses came. The confectioner was not in the hall. He was in the confectionery, or nearby, waiting. The piece had been checked that afternoon, the structural elements tested for stability, the coloring examined in candlelight to see how it would read across a distance, the small repairs made that are always necessary when something has been built over days and handled by more than one pair of hands. It was ready. It was as ready as it was going to be. The subtlety was carried in. It would have moved through the hall on a board, carried by servants who had been instructed to hold it level, to not rush, to allow the room to see it before setting it down. The guests looked. The hall went slightly quieter, in the way that halls go quieter when something unexpected arrives. Even when the arrival was expected, the message was read by the people it was aimed at, in the way it was intended, or near enough. Then the servants set it down, and the guests leaned forward, and it was broken apart. This was the nature of the object. It was made to be destroyed. The confectioner who built it knew this from the beginning, knew that the weeks of work would end in an evening, that the thing he had shaped with such precision would be reduced to fragments on silver dishes and passed around a table. The object's life was measured in hours. He had understood this before he began the first sketch, before he ordered the first measure of sugar, before he made any decision at all about what the piece would be or how it would say what it needed to say. This was not considered a loss. The consumption was the point. Sugar that was eaten demonstrated wealth more completely than sugar that was only displayed. It showed that there was more where this came from, that the destruction of something expensive was not a sacrifice, but an abundance. The eating was the final act of the statement. The piece had done everything it was made to do. By the time the hall had emptied, the confectioner was back in the confectionery. The accounts would need to reconcile in the morning, materials used against preparations delivered, the numbers in the correct columns. The tools were cleaned and returned to their places. The molds were checked for damage. Anything that had broken during the making was noted, assessed, repaired, or replaced. The work of the evening was already becoming the work of the next commission, a feast in 3 weeks, a diplomatic visit, a celebration whose details would arrive when they arrived. He would begin planning when the brief came, assess what the occasion required, and start again. The slow, precise, anonymous work of making something that would say what the court needed said, in the language the court used for saying it. The hall did not know his name. It did not need to. His name was not the point. The objects are gone. Every sugar subtlety made in every English court across 3 centuries has dissolved, crumbled, been eaten, or simply ceased to exist in the way that things made of sugar cease to exist. What remains is the record of them. Household accounts listing the materials purchased, descriptions of occasions, written by observers who noted what was carried into the hall and what it depicted, receipts for sugar and almonds and rose water in quantities that suggest something more elaborate than everyday cooking. The paper trail of a profession that worked in a material that left no physical trace. There are recipe manuscripts, collections of confectionery preparations, written down by practitioners who understood that the knowledge needed to be preserved, even if the objects could not be. These are careful documents, precise about quantities and temperatures and timing, attentive to the small differences that distinguish a preparation that works from one that does not. They are the professional literature of a craft that had no obvious institutional home, written by people who took the work seriously enough to write it down. They describe a world of detail that the court records do not, the exact point at which boiling sugar changes character, the way that marzipan behaves differently depending on the age of the almonds. The preparations that can be made days in advance, and those that cannot. Reading them, you understand something about the knowledge these people carried, not as theory, but as practice, accumulated over years of doing the work in the room behind the hall. And there is one name, and a house in Aldgate, and the fact of the house, which says something about a relationship between a craftsperson and a crown that the accounts alone would not tell you. The confectioner occupied a position that has no clean modern equivalent. Not an artist, the work was commissioned, not expressive, and the maker's intentions were beside the point. Not a servant in the ordinary sense. The skill was too specialized, the judgment too central, the proximity to power too consistent. Something between the two, in a world that did not have precise language for what it was. What they made were not decorations. They were statements, political, dynastic, diplomatic, sometimes threatening. They were made in a language that the court spoke fluently, a language of symbol and allegory and conspicuous expense, and the confectioner was the translator. He moved the meaning from the intention to the object, from the brief to the thing that sat in front of the guests and said what needed to be said. And then the guests ate it, and the evening was over, and the hall returned to its ordinary use, and the confectioner went back to the room where the work was done. The next commission would arrive. It always did. The work was never finished. Only the objects were. That was Hands of History. Next time, we go back inside another room, another profession, another person history forgot to name. If this is where you want to return, subscribe. We will be here. Until next time, sleep well.